Hello, this is a recording for primarily the benefit of the Suffolk Jungian Circle. Although, as with all of these previous recordings, it's going to be put up so that anybody who would like to tune in can listen to it. And if you would like to join in with the monthly meeting on the last Wednesday of the month, 7:30 in the evening, it's an online discussion group, so just drop me an email and I'll send you the link. You don't have to be in Suffolk, although it is billed as the Suffolk group, but we do have people from Essex tuning in, so there's no particular reason why we can't include people from further afield than that as well. Now, the topic that was advertised for the June meeting was the post-Jungians, and having scratched a few notes to myself, I think I'm going to drop the plural, Jungians, for a singular post-Jungian and look at James Hillman for this month. And that then keeps the gates open that if at some point in the future we want to look at another different post-Jungian, we can do a whole session on somebody else. Because I think there's enough to say about James Hillman to occupy the average duration of one of these recordings and to get us chatting in the discussion group. So Hillman passed away in 2011, having made quite a legacy. There's this sort of argument that comes from Andrew Samuels that, very broadly speaking, the post-Jungians can be divided into two main camps. Those who innovate and kind of introduce new ideas and adapt and build on the foundation that Carl Jung laid down, and those who are much more traditionalist, classicalists. At one point, in one of his articles or interviews or something, I can't remember what it was now, he uses the term fundamentalists. Obviously, I suppose that's a bit tongue-in-cheek. He doesn't mean that to... fundamentalism has a bit of a reputation for lunatic fringes. I don't think he means it in quite that way. But people who basically try to be absolutely down the line Carl Jungian followers with no bolt-ons, no additions, no changes, just precisely following in the footsteps of Carl Jung. Now, if we're thinking of James Hillman, he would come under the innovator bracket because he took Jung's basic ideas and then added elements to them and developed them, and indeed coined the term archetypal psychology. Sometimes it's also referred to as polytheist psychology, which is a particular interest to me because I am a polytheist, but I'm not one in the same way that James Hillman is using the term. So for me personally, I believe that there are multiple gods and goddesses and other spirits that float around in the cosmos and occasionally interact with humans and no doubt other creatures as well. I don't regard them as the kind of archetypal forces that James Hillman does, and in fairness that Carl Jung himself also regards them as archetypal forces. So when Hillman is talking about polytheist psychology, he doesn't mean that he is, or was when he was alive, off dancing around candles and invoking Zeus and Apollo and Aphrodite and whoever else. Rather, he means that he believes there are multiple forces, and this is one of the areas where, although it kind of sounds like he's still sticking with Jungian ideas in talking about archetypes, he does introduce an innovation, which is branching away from Jung's original concept, and some Jungians like it and some Jungians don't, as with all of these things. Some do, some don't. One of the innovations he introduces is to suggest that the archetype of the self, which obviously ties in with Jung's ideas of individuation, moving towards a sort of a state of personal growth, personal integration and fulfillment. For him, Hillman that is, the self is one of many archetypal forces. It's not the defining archetypal force the way it is for Carl Jung. So in Jung's perspective, all of the other archetypes kind of cluster around the orbit of the self and contribute to the eventual development of the self through the process of individuation. Hillman is stepping to one side. He's not denying the self as a concept. He's just saying it's not the end all and the be all. It's not the central theme. There are these other archetypes, and they can be forces in their own right rather than corollary forces hanging around the orbit of the self. So that's one of the distinctions that he makes. So there are different ways of personifying the psyche, of understanding the psyche as this complex entity. There's an image which I've seen used in Buddhist writings, and I'm sure probably other writings as well, of a diamond or a ruby and emerald. It doesn't really matter which kind of gemstone, but the idea of a gemstone with multiple facets. So if you imagine a big diamond or a big ruby or something like that that's been cut, so it's got however many facets, and it turns around, and when you look at the gemstone, you maybe are looking at a particular facet, and in looking at that facet you're not paying much attention to any of the other facets, but they are there. And so when we are interacting with either reflecting on our own psyche or trying to understand somebody else's psyche, what we might see is a particular facet of them, a bit of them. We're not seeing the entirety of them, in the same way that when we are gazing up our own fundaments in pursuit of self-understanding, we tend to see a bit of ourselves. We don't usually see the entirety of ourselves, because the entirety is quite big and it's difficult to grasp. I suppose maybe over the course of a remarkably long life, or indeed multiple reincarnations, you might eventually get to see all the different facets as they turn around and understand the kind of the magnitude of it. But difficult to do so in a very short period of time. So there is, this kind of polytheist element, coming back to that, sorry, is that if you imagine each facet as being another god or another goddess, another profound force, that you might see one day you look at it and you see this facet, and a different day you look at it you see a different facet, and they are all ultimately facets of this psyche, this kind of overarching entity, but you see different bits at a time. So he brings that in as a concept and as an idea. One of his more famous books is the Soul Code, if I can even pronounce the word properly. Back in 1997 that was published, and he introduces some ideas there which are I think definitely worth contemplating and discussing in our end of the month meetup. He has an idea of, and the image he uses is an acorn. You could use other images, but we'll stick with the acorn because that's what he uses. So an acorn has in it a blueprint. Now, he is talking about the soul code, so he's kind of thinking of this in quite spiritual terms, the idea of this soul that is part and parcel of the acorn. You could, if you were a bit more of a sort of rationalist scientific bent, think in terms of DNA, genetic coding, or you could think of it conceptualize it in different ways. You'd probably come to the same basic notion at the end of the day, but he's talking about this idea of a soul. So his argument is that the acorn, once it's planted, will always grow into an oak tree. Now, it might be a massive 300-foot tall oak tree, it might be a tiny little bonsaied oak tree growing on the side of a mountain in very shallow soil. It might be a healthy oak tree, it might be a disease-rattled oak tree. Environmental forces come into play, and more than that, the soul itself, as it develops, makes choices, makes decisions, exerts free will. So it's not just a kind of passive recipient of environmental forces that in the way that, obviously, from a pagan point of view, oak trees probably do have choices, but getting up and walking away because they don't like the environment is not one of them. So they are relatively limited in the kinds of choices they can make compared to the kinds of choices that a human being can make. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that he doesn't want Hillman to give too much emphasis to environmental factors in the way that behaviourist psychologists have a tendency to do so, and to some extent Freudian psychoanalysts have a tendency to think about the kind of family dynamics into which the child is born. We are not passive. We are not just these lumps that sit there and the environment does things to us and makes us into this or that type of a person. We can exercise choice. If we don't like the environment, we can go to a different environment. A bit like Viktor Frankl's argument, stuff happens to us, but we choose how to respond to the stuff. We are not just mindlessly going along with things. We are exercising choice in terms of how we respond. So even if we can't control what's happening to us, it's outside our power to prevent certain things happening to us. If there's going to be an earthquake, there's going to be an earthquake. There's bugger all you can do about that. But you can choose how you respond to the earthquake. And that's Frankl's point, you choose how to respond, and that's kind of what Hillman is saying as well, that stuff happens, yes, but we still have choice. Choice is a huge, big, important factor for Hillman in terms of shaping the kind of person we will become, that we will turn into. So it's that idea of, coming back to the acorn will never grow into a holly bush, it will never grow into a willow tree, it will never grow into a hazel tree. It will always grow into an oak tree, but there are lots of different varieties and sizes and so forth of oak trees. So whether it looks like that oak tree over there or that oak tree over there, that is where the kind of individualism through choice and through environment and through various other factors come into play to shape precisely what kind of an oak tree will it be. And so he's arguing that we each of us have this kind of blueprint in our soul of whether we're going to be an oak tree or a willow tree or a hazel tree or whatever, that we are going to grow into a certain kind of a person, but that blueprint is quite broad, so we could be the healthiest, most impressive, most amazing version of that blueprint that you could imagine, or we could be the most stunted, warped, damaged, harmed and harmful version of that blueprint you can imagine. So we have the sort of variations as to quite how we could go. And of course, over a long lifetime, if you're lucky enough to have a long lifetime in the first place, then you might chop and change. So you might go through a bad patch in your 20s and then sort yourself out in your 30s and become a healthier version of yourself. So it's not as if you are kind of going to be one thing, full stop, that's it. You might go through phases of being good versions, bad versions, average versions of the same basic you. What you become is not going to be the same as what the person next door becomes. Their soul code is different from your soul code. So even though we're all humans, hopefully, except for the Daleks, but we're all humans to an extent, and therefore I suppose there's only so many variations of soul codes you can ultimately have. But nonetheless, there is difference, so that it is not the case that everybody is going to turn out the same. And that is in keeping, I suggest, with Jung's idea. So going back to when he's talking about the red books, and the other month when we were discussing his ideas around UFOs, and that chap, what was his name? Orfeo Angelini, I think it was. Who had all these weird experiences with, well, who knows what they were, but he believed they were aliens when he was off wandering around California. And then he started passing on the messages from the aliens to other people, and he got quite a big sort of following behind him of people who wanted to hear what the aliens had to say. Jung was of the view that Orfeo had kind of missed the point, that the visions were for his benefit, for him to grow, for him to develop in certain directions. They weren't there for him to go and preach them and pass them on to everybody else, and everybody else goes, oh, we must go and do what you say, mighty Orfeo, and we must follow the teachings of the alien masters, because their souls would have their own messages and not need to follow the messages for Orfeo. in the same way that he was a bit worried that if people read books, they would misinterpret what was basically, I suppose from Hillman's point of view, Jung's blueprint, or whatever you want to call it, for his own spiritual development, and they might start taking that as some kind of, well, if it's good enough for Jung, it's good enough for me. I ought to be doing these things that Jung is doing in his red books. He didn't want that to happen. It was kind of a very private thing, which is why he didn't publish them in his lifetime. It only got published after he was dead and buried. So there is this kind of sense in which what is true for my soul might not be true for yours, and somebody else's and somebody else's. So it is not that we all have to be following some kind of identikit pattern of spiritual development. We have to follow our own pattern of spiritual development, become what we can become. He has some ideas around development, not so much the kind of childhood development that Michael Fordham is talking about, but just a kind of lifetime, a bit more like Erickson, lifelong development, in which he is arguing that we are agents of our own growth, and the soul itself is a stimulating force that moves towards producing growth. So I suppose going back to the acorn again, you could say there is an impulse in the acorn that, given the right kind of environment, the soil, water, eventually sunlight, there is something that kind of triggers off, and the acorn cracks open and it sends out a little shoot, and the shoot reaches up towards the sunlight, and then roots come down and start drawing in nutrients, the impulse to grow. So the acorn isn't sitting there like a lump waiting for somebody to tell it to grow. It has this inner clock that drives it, this inner impulse, urge, or whatever you want to call it, instinct, to grow in certain ways. And by analogy, humans are the same. We have this impulse to grow. So from infancy onwards, not that I really know anything about infants because I prefer puppies, but from the parents I know, they tell me that right from the kind of practically the minute they fall out the womb, there are definite signs of personality, of drive, of interest, that some babies have this kind of temperament, some babies have that kind of temperament. They are actively responding. They're not just lumps that sit there waiting for the environment to press upon them. They are not this kind of blank slate tabula rasa idea that you get in behaviourism, rather that there is a sort of a very active element, which Hillman is thinking in terms of the soul. The baby has a soul, it's there, it's growing. So this is different from Ouspensky's argument that we are all empty vessels waiting to acquire souls by self-reflection and meditation and prayer and devotion and so on. Rather, it's there from the get-go, as far as Hillman is concerned, and it's pushing us, our kind of psyche, our ego, our more day-to-day consciousness, pushing it in certain directions. So there may be external forces pushing us this way, and that's society, parents, employers, school teachers, whoever, pushing us this way, pushing us that way. But there is also an inner drive pushing us to make certain choices, certain decisions. And when we make the right decisions, things fall into place for us because we are kind of going with the grain of our own wood. And when we make bad, poor decisions, things get awkward and difficult, and we trip over our own feet and problems ensue, which are partly just the result of doing the wrong thing anyway, but also could be understood as a sort of a nudge to get back on track by making the wrong decisions less and less pleasant in their consequences. If they were too pleasant, a bit like the ancient Greek story of the lotus eaters, you make life too easy for someone, too cushy for someone, they sit on their jacksie and do nothing. So you need to nettle them to make them get off their backside and make an effort and do something, not just coast along like some useless lump. Oh, I was watching some crime documentary thing the other night about some American, I was going to say kid, actually. I think he was about 20, 23, 24, so not a child at all. He kind of looked like one. Whose mum, lived in his parents' house, and his mum and dad were nagging him to get a job, so he shot his father in the head and then tried to murder his mother. She survived somehow. Because he didn't want to stop playing computer games. That's what he did all day long. He sat in the basement, which is probably why he looked so pale and unhealthy, and just arsed around on computer games whilst mum and dad fed him and watered him and clothed him and did God knows what, probably wiped his backside for him. And when they finally said to him, "Get off your bum and do something," he flipped out and killed one of them and nearly killed the other. So the dangers of becoming inert. I suppose a Catholic might talk of acedia and sloth, the sin of sloth, as actually a lot more dangerous than that kind of comic image of Homer Simpson slopped out on the sofa. That there are much more pronounced risks of sloth. And I'm rambling off at a tangent here, but there is that inner drive not to fall into sloth, but to keep moving, keep growing, make an effort, commit to a positive, what the ancient Greeks would have called a eudaimonic path, as your life falls into place, like the bits of a jigsaw come together and you start to see what the pattern is and you go, aha, it makes sense now. And everything starts to kind of gear in the right direction. Because if you just go for the lazy option, go for the self-destructive option, go for the power-crazed option, there's all sorts of wrong directions you can go in, then trouble ensues. And he would see that a bit like Jung's argument about synchronicity, where the inner world and the outer world mirror each other. So if your inner world, that soul world, knows that your conscious ego is making the wrong decisions, it starts to send out a cry to change, and the outer world responds by giving you unpleasant consequences to your poor decision making to goad you into the right direction rather than just coasting along being useless or destructive or whatever it is that you're being. He talks quite a lot in that book about the diamond complexes, an idea which goes hand in glove with Rollo May, another person we could talk about in the future recording discussion thing. Rollo May uses the ancient Greek term daimon. Now, to the ancient Greeks, a daimon is, well, difficult to translate it quite into a modern day English language concept. It's not really a god or a goddess, although it is much weirder than a human being in a sense. Or is it weirder or is it simpler? Now, there's a question. To the Greek mind, and indeed most minds, I suppose, really, a god, a goddess is a very complex, vastly complex entity. There's all sorts of things they may take an interest in. Apollo is the god of the sun, but he's also the god of music, he's also the god of healing, he's the god of plagues, he's the god of beauty, he's the god of all sorts of things. He's not a one-note character, he's a god of multiple things. And all the gods and goddesses have multiplicity. Like going back to that gemstone with the many different facets, there's a lot to them. You can't live for 1 million years and not have a lot to you. Humans, well, hopefully, have a lot to them. A multitude of hobbies and interests and likes and dislikes and relationships. You're a brother, a son, an uncle, an employee, a friend, this, that, the other. All these different ways of understanding ourselves. There's a lot to us, the facets of the gemstone. A daimon, in both the way the ancient Greeks used it, the way Rollo May uses it, the way James Hillman uses it, is a one-note creature. So in some respects, it's actually more simple than a human being, although it's a very weird thing. But whereas as a human being we could have 50, 60, 70 facets to our gemstone, a diamond has one. And the diamonds described by the ancient Greeks, there's lists and lists of the things. A lot of them are linked to emotions, not all of them, some of them to other things, but a lot of it. So there's one of hate, one of fear, one of hope, one of happiness, one of joy, one of sorrow. They're each these emotional one-note trick ponies that have a quality to them. Without getting too far down the horror movie line, you could argue this relationship to emotion is slightly culinary, in that they are consuming the energies, or whatever you want to call them. I'm not sure quite what the right word would be, but they a bit like a plant consumes sunlight. So a diamond consumes hate, or love, or hope, or despondency, or whatever it is. So they kind of target humans who are exhibiting those emotions, and they're drawn to them. And they exacerbate those emotions when they get there. So maybe you're feeling a little bit despondent, and then the diamond moves in, and suddenly you're feeling nothing but despondent, and it just overwhelms you as the kind of feeding cycle kicks in, if that's not too melodramatic a way of putting it. Now, when Rollo May repackages this concept, and Hillman likewise, they're not talking about spirits in the same way the ancient Greeks were, as these kind of mystical entities. Rather, they are describing complexes, psychological hang-ups that are not wholly unique to the individual. So the client, the patient in front of the therapist, they are the one with the complex, but they're not the only one with that complex. Other people have similar complexes, and a lot of complexes, and this it kind of starts shading a little bit sociological, are, how should we say it, culturally induced. They are very common in certain cultures, that different cultures have different complexes, that they not everyone who exists in that culture will get the complex and end up having to see a therapist, but they float in the cultural soup. And if you are also swimming in the cultural soup, there is the chance that the complex, the diamond, will find you and become part of you. And it could be argued, Rollo May and James Hillman both would argue, that it's possible for a diamond to have a bit of a nibble at us, so to speak. Many of us have elements of a very small scale, elements of complexes about them. But it's comparatively rare for that complex to sort of totally possess you, where it takes you over to the point where there's nothing else left of you. That's when it becomes very pathological, and you're likely to end up with a very messy life and all sorts of problems kicking in. And it's linking in, from a mental health perspective, to ideas around manias and obsessions and delusional fixations, where one frame of mind, one way of thinking, one thing takes over a person's life until there's nothing else left of them. It just kind of eats them up from the inside, like a spiritual version of a cancerous tumour that would eat up the body, except this eats up the soul, and it just consumes it away until it's difficult to see that person as a real person, as an individual, the complex individual they used to be, because this diamond has eaten all of that away, and now they are just this repeating pattern of certain emotions, certain ideas that, like a scratched record, it just keeps playing the same thing again and again and again and again, which becomes incredibly wearing for all of the people around them, as well as no doubt wearing for them too, to have to keep going through it, because often people, when they're in that state of mind, don't know how to break free. They may be very aware that their life is going down the toilet, but they don't know what to do about it. They don't know. If they did, they'd go and do it, wouldn't they? So they get stuck in this rut, this repeat rut that goes on and on and on. So that's when your kind of soul code is being derailed into these destructive patterns of repetition, where it just plays out and plays out and plays out. I'm sure we can think of a few examples to talk of as practical demonstrations of what a modern day daimon might be, rather than one of the ancient Greek ones. In terms of people getting stuck in thought patterns, stuck in certain understandings. I was going to say I won't name names. It wouldn't matter a damn if I did, because I don't suppose anybody would know who the hell I'm talking about anyway. But many years ago, she might well be dead by now actually, I did know someone who had for many years worked in primary schools. I was so kind of stuck in that, what should we say, school mom mindset, that it didn't matter who she was talking to. It didn't matter if it was a small child or a 40-year-old or an 80-year-old or whatever they might be. She spoke to absolutely everyone as if they were 6 and treated them, not to annoy them, not to do it deliberately. I don't think she was even aware she was doing it. She just got so stuck in this mindset of obviously responding to the kids in the primary school in a certain way. And I could imagine even some of them might have found it annoying to be spoken to in quite such a condescending fashion. But it had spilled out into her entire life. And it wasn't just me who felt this. I knew other people who knew her as well, and they all said pretty much the same thing, that she was kind of trapped in this role and couldn't move out of it. Didn't even know she was in it half the time, I'm sure. That everyone was infantilized around her. Everyone had to be spoken to like they were a very small child who didn't really understand much of anything, and kept busy and occupied with little games. And she didn't mean any harm, but I imagine she would have been a bloody nightmare to live with if you were related to her. To have to keep going through that, being treated in that way by someone who was so oblivious to the fact that they were doing it. So that could be an example of a complex or a daimon, of somebody trapped in a very, very limited frame of mind who cannot move out of it. Most of us, there's a way we behave at work, there's a way we behave at home, there's a way we behave down the pub with our mates. We move between different versions of ourselves, different facets of the gem. But she had got stuck in one, as if she was a gemstone with one facet, one way of being, one way of thinking, one way of communicating, who no longer understood any other way. And it's not healthy. I don't know if she lived long enough to retire, but what becomes of you when you retire if you're that consumed by your job that you don't know how to operate outside of your job? Not healthy. So there is that element going on. Another part, coming back to James Hillman. He was very enamoured of one particular archetype, the pure eternus, the eternal child, and argues that one of the reasons why he didn't the self, it was the defining central archetype along which everything else unites around, is because he saw the eternal child as resistant to change, resistant to growing up. It's that kind of Peter Pan thing that wants to be a kid forever and ever and ever. Doesn't want to grow up, doesn't want to mature, doesn't want to let the past go. But it keeps, even as the body is aging, it's still repeating the same childlike patterns, the same, not wanting to leave go of the fashions of yesteryear, not wanting to change appearance. I suppose you could think of the huge popularity of plastic surgery, of people who want to go on looking 30 years younger than they actually are because they don't want to admit that they're getting a bit wrinkly and a bit saggy and hairline is receding or whatever else, and they're perpetually trying to fix their body in amber and not allow the passage of time, because if they allow their body to change, then they have to allow their mind to change and mature. And his argument, whereas a lot of psychologists, because this has become a bit of a bone of contention between Hillman and other Jungians, who think he is mistaken on this one, because they see that fixation on the eternal child as unhealthy. So if somebody's exhibiting that, they need help and support to move on. Whereas he sees it as a more positive thing, that the goal of the self is to mature, is to individuate, is to grow up, whereas the eternus, the child, does not want to move on. It wants to just be in this fluid, playful state. Today we'll play at cops and robbers, tomorrow we'll play at cowboys and Indians or something, and it wants to just kind of play at different states rather than mature and grow and become something new and leave that childhood in the past as a thing of the past. So for him, that's not only desirable, it is the natural state to be in. So it's not a whole disagreement with other Jungians, because they are agreeing with each other about the different archetypes. They're just having a dispute, I suppose, as to which ones are the most important archetypes. So Jung himself and the people who follow quite closely on Jung's heels are saying it is the self that is the driving force, the centralizing force, the move to growth and maturity and reconciliation of opposites, and the transformation of dualities into unities as it grows forward. Whereas Hillman, is saying no, it's the eternal child that's the kind of critical factor, and that we should embrace it and spend a lifetime being different things rather than playing and kind of resisting the siren call of the self, of the process towards individuation. So it doesn't go down well with some Jungians, but others are maybe more amenable to the idea and the concept. So there's that element of his thoughts. We could talk about that in the discussion session. He's very keen on art and the idea of what Jung would call participation mystique, of finding ourselves through expressing ourselves in music, in art, in drama, in anything creative, sculpture, embroidery. I don't suppose it matters too much what it is, but something creative, of making things and putting the things we've made out there into the world as vessels for carrying us, and then we kind of reflect back on them. We see ourselves through the things we have created and invested ourselves in. So that becomes a therapeutic technique for Hillman to discover the different bits of yourself. And you can align the art with the polytheism angle by creating different art for expressing different bits of you. So an art for your maternal side, an art for your piece of art, for your shadow side, a piece of art for your masculine side, expressing the different bits of yourself through different artistic endeavours, and then rather than try to unify them into some central self, is just to sort of have this pantheon of elements of your being, and be content with that. And in some respects, it's not dissimilar to what John Rowan is arguing with the subpersonality thesis, where he suggests that it's a perfectly natural state for us all to be in, to have multiple selves. A straightforward example would be someone who is Mr. Smith at work, and Bob to his mates at the rugby club, and Robert to his wife, and Dad to his kids, and Bobby to his dotty old grandmother. Different names for different aspects of himself, sometimes different dress. He dresses one way at work and another way at the rugby club, and so on and so on. So there are maybe different language patterns. What the kind of things he says to his mates at rugby, hopefully very different from the kind of things he says to his grandmother, or the kind of things he says to his own children. So his language frames, if we want to get all a bit Wittgenstein for a second, are shifting between the different identities. In a healthy mind, Rowan argues, we know we have all these different versions of ourselves, and we consciously move between them. Where it becomes unhealthy and pathological, often as a result of some horrendous trauma that's never been dealt with, is that some people start to split and shard, and they become unaware that there is this or that or the other version of themselves. So instead of and this is kind of where Rowan is a little bit more Jungian and a bit less Hillmanian, if that's even a word, in that he is saying that there is this central coordinating self, which is like the manager of a board of directors who knows the names of all the other people on the board. Or, if you want to put it in Hillman's terms, a pantheon of gods. There is a chief god or a chief goddess who knows the names of all the other gods and goddesses, who is the kind of the coordinating force that knows all of the others. If that coordinating force is damaged and it becomes unaware of this facet, that facet, then what you end up with is somebody who goes into fugue states. And for a few minutes, a few hours, maybe even a few days, they kind of black out. They go and do stuff as this other version of themselves. And when that other version wears off and recedes into the unconsciousness, and what theoretically is the coordinating bit of themselves comes to the fore again, it doesn't know what it's been doing for the last 10 minutes, 10 hours, however long a period of time. That is a fugue state, is blanked off. It's not accessible to the conscious mind. And people like John Rowan associate that with things like horrific sexual trauma that may have happened to someone, child abuse, that sort of thing, that can lead to this breaking down into dissociative identity disorder, which is the what used to be called a multiple personality disorder is now called dissociative identity disorder, as an extreme version of what is actually a perfectly normal state of mind to be in. The normal version, you know the different selves. The abnormal version, you no longer are aware of all of your different selves. There are some of them, at least, you don't know exist, which you cannot exert conscious control over. They take over when they do. It's no longer your choice to act like Mr. Smith at work or act like Bob at the rugby club. It happens out of your conscious control, and then it turns off out of your conscious control, which can be, I'd imagine, quite a freaky sort of experience. You can also tie in with some religious practices, such as in Candomblé or Santeria, where people engage in spirit riding, as a common term for it, where they call upon a deity or an ancestor or some such, and they work up into a trance state, into a frenzy, and the spirit, the god, the deity, whatever it is, takes possession of their body, and for a short period of time, usually just a few minutes, they will walk differently, talk differently, move differently, because essentially the spirit is talking through them. And their conscious day-to-day self, Fred or whatever, switches off and may be completely unaware of what is happening for the duration of the possession. So when the possession is over and done with, Fred comes back into control and goes, oh, what did I say? What did I do? How long was I away for? The people who've been taking part in the ritual say, oh, well, you've been gone for 20 minutes and you said this and you did that and blah, blah, blah. It's their body, but somebody else is in charge of it. Now, within a religious context, it is very genuinely believed to be a deity or an ancestral spirit that's in charge of them. Obviously, from a Jungian perspective, well, there's nothing to preclude a Jungian from actually believing in gods and goddesses, of course, but for the more cynical or atheistic or whatever, they might say it's not really a god or a goddess, it's actually an archetype, it's a complex or a daimon, it's one of these repressed facets emerging from the unconscious mind. It's still you, but it's a different bit of you. A bit of you you're not normally aware of, that is now in control and exerting dominance over what's going on. So that kind of comes into play with this notion of different selves, the idea of there being a pantheon of gods, so to speak, internal to our own mind, taking on roles, taking on charge at different points in time. The parental side of us, the childlike side of us, the sexual side of us, the angry side of us. There's like, Aphrodite and Ares and Demeter and whatever else, the gods and the goddesses of the pantheons of the ancient world, internalized into our own psyche as different bits of us, which, well, from one point of view, take turns in utilizing the body, without necessarily there being a conscious centralizing force in charge of it. From a strict, down the line Jungian point of view, there needs to be a centralizing force in charge of this process, coordinating it, stopping it from getting out of control, stopping it from getting dangerous. But for Hillman, not necessarily so. I think just look at the time, gone. So a last very little bit to round up on, because I don't want to go on for too long. He does write a fair amount about psychopathology, and he goes back to the roots of the word, which are easy to forget. So psychopathology is the words, the language, the logos of the pathos, the suffering psyche, the suffering soul. So the language of the suffering soul is a wonderfully poetic way of putting it, and it's for him, it's a reminder that when someone is mentally disturbed, they're acting very bizarrely, in a very distressed or indeed distressing to other people manner. It is the soul inside of them, back to that acorn soul again, crying out in a language of distress, a language of fear, a language of dread, a language of dysfunction, asking for help, which is a much more poetic way of thinking about mental illness than just this sort of slightly mechanistic idea of, your serotonin levels are off the planet again, better give you some medication, and treating it as a very kind of chemical process. But for him, it's treating it and understanding it as a more spiritual process, that this is it's not random and meaningless. It is a language, it is speech, it is a way of the psyche communicating to the outside world by saying, I need help, I am damaged in such and such a way, and therefore I'm going to behave in this weird fashion to draw attention, to draw help, to try and get someone to notice what's going on and help me, because I don't know how to help myself. So that puts a different context, I think, on understandings of aberrant mental behaviour. And that maybe is something we can talk about in the discussion group, but I'll draw it to a close there. And just to reiterate, if you're listening to this and you're not on the usual mailing list, but you would like to take part in the monthly discussions, give me a shout, and I will send the link across to you. It's a Teams link. You can click on the link and join in the discussions, and hopefully gain something from it and contribute something useful to it. Take care.